The G20 chair says the declaration is almost ready, but it's never been easier for the leaders of the world to find common ground. Now, how challenging will it be this time? Joining me is Professor Hyun-jin. Welcome.
Good evening. Nice to meet you.
So let's jump right into it. Should we be concerned that there'll be no declaration at the end of the summit?
While Russia's war in Ukraine shows no signs of a settlement right now, and the world is watching how leaders representing the 20 largest economies will tackle the crisis of climate change, the food crisis, and the worsening debt crisis of developing countries. And nevertheless, the many media predict that it will be very difficult to produce a joint declaration at this G20 summit. And also there was a previous G20 ministerial meetings, and this meeting had ended without any agreement due to disagreements among its members. And also the absence of a Chinese President Xi Jinping and the Russian the Vladimir Putin makes this G20 meeting less weighty than in previous years. And also the absence of these two leaders shows that it is unlikely that China and Russia will agree to a joint declaration this time. So last year, there was a G20 summit in Indonesia. And at that time, the G20 leaders narrowly adopted a joint declaration stating that most members strongly condemned the war in Ukraine. So it is interesting because they condemned the war, not Russia.
Right.
But frankly, even this level of a statement is not easy this time. So if the summit ends without any joint declaration, it will show the limits of Western and non-Western cooperation. And this is not a good news for dealing with global challenges such as Ukraine war, the climate change, and also food crisis. So I'm very afraid that a multilateral diplomatic conference like G20 is becoming less able to combat common challenges when the world is divided into rival camps.
Right, not too optimistic for now, but that's why Indian Prime Minister Modi is so concerned that the Ukraine crisis may overshadow the summit again this year. Now, why is he trying so hard to represent the voices of developing countries, the global south?
So that is a very India's foreign strategy nowadays. So in the middle of the conflict between the two largest economies, such as United States and China, and also the protracted war in Ukraine, the so-called middle powers are rising to the center of international politics. And those middle powers include the countries like India, Indonesia, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and South Africa. And these middle powers are moving between the great powers to pursue their national interests rather than falling into one of the rival camps. So while not participating in the Western-led sanctions against Russia, these middle powers are using their geopolitical position to strengthen their role in the international community. And now Indian Prime Minister Modi is attracting global attention, trying to showcase the changing role of middle powers by chairing this G20 this year. So foreign media predict that India will use this meeting to maximize its geopolitical value to position itself as the next great economic and diplomatic power. And the very luxurious welcome dinner hosted by President Joe Biden during Modi's state visit to Washington in June this year clearly showed India's elevated status in the international community. So based on this power and status, so India's Modi is trying to use his leadership to unite emerging economies in the global south to address climate change and food security crisis around the world. So that is a basic direction of Indian foreign policy under Modi's leadership.
Right, then briefly, Professor, how successful do you think that plan will actually go this time at this summit?
There are some successful side and less successful side.
Okay.
So let me go first with the more successful side. So India is the biggest beneficiary of the global supply chain competition between U.S. and China. As the two great powers tussle diplomatically, India has emerged as the factory of the world, just next to China. And also, India is actively seeking economic and technological support from the United States, which sees India as a key partner in this global competition. So in the case of Ukraine, India has not condemned the war or joined the sanction against Russia, but has been buying Russian oil at bargain prices. So in doing so, India is not only gaining economic benefits, but also diplomatic gains through smart diplomacy between Russia and the United States. So India is quite good at walking the tightrope between great powers. So this is a successful side, but there are less successful sides as well. So at this G20, India wants to unite the members by adopting a summit declaration in support of developing economies at this summit. But this effort will face a lot of challenges. So India seeks greater voices for developing countries, but war in Ukraine could overshadow these talks. So it is not easy for 20 leaders of the world to find the common ground when the Russia's war in Ukraine poses a greater challenge for meaningful agreement at this G20 meeting. So as you said, the Prime Minister Modi has promised, not to let the Ukraine issue to overshadow the needs of developing countries in the global south. But I believe the many issues are closely affected by the war in Ukraine, and the rivalry between the U.S. and China make this Modi's effort very difficult.
Right. But the thing is, the rivalry, speaking of rivalry between U.S. and China, President Xi Jinping is not at the summit. Now, how can Biden take this as an opportunity? Like, what do you think?
Yes, it is some opportunity for the United States, especially for President Biden. So there was the meeting between Joe Biden and also Prime Minister Modi yesterday, just a day before the G20 summit begins. And the Biden expressed his desire for greater cooperation between U.S. and India, and the face-to-face meeting between Biden and Modi comes 3 months after Modi's state visit to the United States in this June. So according to the White House, the two leaders established the importance of the Quad. There's a 4 countries security consultative group, and for a free and inclusive Indo-Pacific region. And these two leaders also reaffirmed their commitment to deepening bilateral security cooperation, including space, artificial intelligence, and also defense. So these two countries also agreed to work together to build a resilient global semiconductor supply chain. So President Biden reaffirmed the U.S. commitment to invest in the semiconductor-related research and development for India. So how can we interpret this American move in India? So in the absence of Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, the United States is trying to make a united front with India in its efforts to contain China. So including the Quad and the semiconductor supply chain. But I think, based on the basic principle of Indian foreign policy, India is likely to maintain still its strategic some balance or ambiguity between these two great powers.
Right. It looks like Biden really has the entire summit as to himself. Now, he's also looking to pitch reforms to lending institutions like the World Bank. Now, the question is, why do you think China may be against this objective?
Yes, there are some efforts to reform international financial institutions such as World Bank and IMF. And U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and also said that Joe Biden will showcase American support for developing countries at this G20 meeting. And as a way to achieve this goal and show the American leadership, the President Biden is reforming this institution to increase support for developing countries in the global south. And in fact, the U.S. government has recently asked Congress for an additional $3.3 billion for the World Bank to boost lending for climate change and also infrastructure projects in developing countries. And the U.S. wants other countries to increase their support for World Bank as well, to increase the World Bank lending capacity. So I think this is a type of response to China, which has recently provided vast amounts of money into developing countries through its One Belt, One Road policy. So Biden is making the most of Xi Jinping's absence by emphasizing the U.S. support for developing countries through these efforts. And in other words, the absence of Xi Jinping and Putin provide Biden with some opportunity to expand his global influence. And therefore, it is natural that China is not happy toward this American effort. And because China believes that this kind of reform of international financial institution is a part of American containment policy against China.
Right. Professor Choi, I know North Korean issues are not going to be discussed as much as, the crisis in Ukraine or the food security, but we should be expecting some sort of consensus on North Korea issues, right?
Yes. So, unfortunately, North Korea is not a main agenda of this G20 meeting. But at this meeting, President Yoon Suk-yeol is expected to somehow criticize North Korea's nuclear and missile provocation and call for the international community's cooperation in denuclearization of North Korea and also the enforcement of economic sanctions against Pyongyang. And also, as you mentioned before, the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un is going to visit Russia next week. So many people expect that. So for a summit meeting with Vladimir Putin to discuss possible arms deal. So North Korea could ask Russia to send more food, energy, and also advanced military technology in return for supplying arms to Russia. So regarding this, the White House sent a strong warning message to Pyongyang, saying that North Korea will pay a price in the international community, and if we provide weapons to Russia. And therefore, at the G20, the President Yoon Suk-yeol is likely to send a warning message to North Korea for its military cooperation with Russia, because this is a clear violation of UN Security Council sanctions against North Korea that threatened world peace. But as I said earlier, there will be. I don't think there will be clear some action plan or mentioning of North Korean threat in the joint declaration.
All right. Professor Choi, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.